I walk a straight line, shackled and chained. Oh, gruesome Gertie is calling my name. There is no mercy in this penitentiary. Just ask the Hillstring Gang or Angola 3. I'm here for life, I'm here to die. Inside these walls, inside the wire. And when the wolf cries, I know it's over. Oh, bloody Angola. Oh, bloody Angola.
Hey, everyone, and welcome back to Bloody Angola, a podcast 142 years in the making, the complete story of America's bloodiest prison. I'm Jim Chapman, and today I'm continuing with the second part in the crimes of Matthew McLaughlin. The last time that I left you, McLaughlin had been found guilty in the murder of his wife, Mary Ann McLaughlin, and was sentenced to life inside of Bloody Angola. So if you haven't heard that episode, quickly go back, listen to that, and then come back to this one. If you're all caught up, we'll get into it. And this was in late March of 2001 when McLaughlin was sentenced. Now, it didn't take long before McLaughlin started acting up in prison. Not long at all. On Wednesday, March 6th of 2002, just a year into his sentence, the following news blurb comes out in the Daily Word Opelousas newspaper. You're not going to believe this. The headline reads, "Convicted murderer stopped in Angola escape attempt. A man convicted of killing his estranged wife in 1998 made an unsuccessful escape attempt at Louisiana State Penitentiary. Guards discovered Roy Matthew McLaughlin, 44, missing from a dormitory during an inmate count on Sunday night. Officers later saw him trying to get to an exercise yard's inner fence." This from West Feliciana Parish Sheriff Sergeant Spence Dilworth. Quote, "You got me," security officers quoted McLaughlin as saying, according to Dilworth. The officer seized a bag made from the legs of blue jeans and stuffed with candy bars, maps, and other survival gear. McLaughlin was convicted last year of the second-degree murder in the death of Maureen McLaughlin. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and he will be booked later with attempted simple escape. Apparently, McLaughlin was not enjoying his time inside Bloody Angola and behind that wire and attempted to get out. So that was a shot, right? He gets caught, and surely so many eyes are on this convicted murderer at this point that he can't take a piss without someone knowing. Well, something just quite honestly shocking to me occurred when on April 6th of 2005 came out in the Alexandria's Town Talk newspaper. And its headline reads, "Guard accused of trying to help two escape Angola." Investigators who were trying to find out what motivated a young guard at Angola to allegedly unlock cell and hallway doors for two convicted murderers who were trying to escape. Quote, "He said he was being intimidated by the inmates, and we don't necessarily believe that, so we're continuing to investigate his motives." That from the West Feliciana Parish Sheriff's Captain Spencer Dilworth. Sergeant Franklin Schaefer, 25, was released on bond a day after he was booked for assisting the escape. Assistant Warden Kathy Fontenot said Schaefer had been a guard at the prison for a little more than a year, and authorities said he had no criminal background. Schaefer allegedly helped inmates Roy McLaughlin, 47 at this point, y'all, and David Wamick, 28 get as far as the outside yard at Angola's Camp C to gain freedom. The two inmates still had to scale a perimeter fence, but a tower guard froze them with gunshots that were meant to wound but narrowly missed. Quote, "It was very close," Fontenot said. The failed escape attempt happened before daylight on Monday, but Sergeant Leslie Powell, who had been on the tower for nearly 12 hours, spotted them and responded quickly, Fontenot said. "She did extremely well. It's not a regular occurrence when you fall back instinctively on training. It's great, and to preserve life is good too," she said. After the inmates were captured, prison officials immediately suspected a guard had helped them. The inmates can't get out unless someone opens the door. They don't have a key, and they also got out of the hall door, Fontenot said. She went on to say the only person who has the key is the officer for the hall, who at the time was Schaefer. And y'all, they refer to those as key men. Schaefer admitted later Monday that he had opened the doors for the two inmates, but at first would not say why. It was the second escape attempt for McLaughlin, who lived in Baton Rouge. In 2002, guards conducted a head count of inmates filing indoors and noticed McLaughlin was missing. They quickly found him trying to get to an exercise yard, and of course, I just told you that story. So there you have it, a second escape just a few years later, and unbelievable that a guard would help them escape. But y'all, that happens more often than you may think. There's a lot of good guards out there, but there's good and bad in every profession, and this guy was definitely the bad. Now, I tried to find out what happened to that guard, but I just couldn't get any information. The trail on that case just kind of ends after his arrest. I'm sure he got into some trouble, but I can't find on the research that I've done exactly what happened to him. So surely after getting caught a second time attempting to escape, old Roy learned his lesson, right? Nope, not Roy. Let's go to January 27th of 2010 and the Bogalusa Daily News, who reported this. Inmate caught trying to escape from Angola last weekend. Convicted murderer was trying to escape a third time. A convicted murderer from Baton Rouge made his third unsuccessful escape attempt Sunday afternoon from Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. Correctional officers captured him before he could get to leave the prison grounds. Roy McLaughlin, 52 at this point, serving a life sentence for second-degree murder, used a key made from a battery to unlock restraints on his hands after he was allowed into the special exercise yard at Angola's Camp J. And y'all know the history of Camp J. I've done an episode on this. It's now closed for good, but at one point, that was the lockdown, if you will, for prisoners. So he was in Camp J. That's pretty hard to escape from. So he uncuffs himself from that key made out of a battery, and McLaughlin then used restraints to pull aside the razor wire on one fence and use his prison jumpsuit and the restraints to climb over a second fence. That according to Kathy Fontenot. McLaughlin then began running toward the employee residential area at Angola. That's the beeline, y'all. But camp security officers spotted him running over, and Major Chad Oob pursued on foot. Oob radioed the prison control center to alert the prison chase team. The response by the team and other employees resulted in McLaughlin's capture about 15 minutes later. Prisoners assigned to Camp J's maximum security cells are allowed to exercise for 1 hour per day. McLaughlin was convicted in the second-degree murder, and of course it goes into his conviction. So there you have that, a third escape attempt. Now, this is where it gets really crazy in this testimony. Apparently, Angola guards, they got a little bit sick of Roy trying to get out of prison, and they figured it may be time to try, well, a different form of deterrent, if you will. So what happened? Well, for this, I'm going to refer to Roy's own handwritten lawsuit that I just so happen to have possession of, which The first grievance was filed just a couple of days after this incident. It was on January 29th of 2010, and this is his own words. And before we get into what he claims is his statement of facts, the defendants in this lawsuit are Burl Cain, of course. There's an episode way back in the beginning of Bloody Angola that talks about Burl Cain. So he's a defendant. Robert Butler, who was an assistant warden at Angola that was in charge of the welfare of all the inmates at Louisiana State Penitentiary. A correctional officer by the name of Kevin Groom. A correctional officer by the name of Mark Sharp. And 3 John Does who apparently McLaughlin did not know their names. But let's get into the facts of what he claimed. It says, on Sunday, January 24th, 2010, about 1:20 p.m., and he refers to himself as the plaintiff. The plaintiff began an attempted simple escape from Louisiana State Penitentiary's Camp J. Well, at least he admitted it, right? Plaintiff evacuated through an opening of the chain link fence in the recreational yard and proceeded to climb and cross over 2 chain link perimeter gates. After landing on his feet, he made sure he put that, on the outside of the perimeter gates, plaintiff sprinted about 100 yards to a drainage canal west of the camp. Once in the canal, plaintiff noticed a very small puncture wound to his left palm caused by barbed wire over those gates. Upon information and belief, the plaintiff was seen by security personnel running south in the drainage canal. Plaintiff evacuated the canal shortly thereafter, turning east and jogging across a cattle pasture and crossing 2 short barbed wire fences. At about 1:40 p.m., plaintiff surrendered peacefully to Warden Robert Butler, who was standing at post with a pistol in his right hand near an area known as the B-line. Upon surrendering to Warden Robert Butler, the plaintiff was ordered to get on his knees and then ordered belly and face down horizontally on the ground. Thereafter, the warden approached the plaintiff, discharging his pistol several times toward the sky to signal security personnel as to his whereabouts. Seconds later, a middle-aged officer arrives on the scene, and he handcuffs the plaintiff's hands behind his back and then frisked and or searched the plaintiff's body. The officer discovered a bag of trail mix, cashews, small Bic lighter, vitamins, allergy tablets, and various small cloth items. Plaintiff was stripped nude from his waist down. Minutes later, a pickup truck with several correctional officers arrived on the scene, and one of the officers jogged over to the plaintiff and suddenly, without provocation from the plaintiff, stomped on the right side of the plaintiff's face near the right eye of the plaintiff and kicked the plaintiff 2 times in the side of his body. Warden Robert Butler stood next to the plaintiff, lying belly down on the ground, and said nothing to the officer who assaulted and battered the plaintiff. Plaintiff was able to look up and peek at the officer during the assault and battery of the plaintiff, and later identified a photograph of that officer. Upon information and belief, the plaintiff's legs were shackled at the ankles, and then officers violently pulled the plaintiff up off the ground by grabbing and pulling up on the plaintiff's arms, causing strains and or sprains to his rotary cuff and elbow joints. The plaintiff was then tossed deliberately and maliciously, head first and belly down, onto the bed of the truck. Upon information and belief, Captain Mark Sharp initially assaulted and battered the plaintiff. Defendant John Doe number 1, a white male, then slammed the truck's tailgate onto the plaintiff's left foot. The plaintiff, in the way he writes, y'all, he sounds very educated, which is pretty wild for this convicted piece of shit wife murderer. But anyway, he howled like a Canadian wolf due to the unbearable pain. That slamming of the tailgate on plaintiff's foot may have been the causation of the plaintiff's left fractured toe, or fractured moments later when a second assault and battery began on the plaintiff. John Doe positioned himself as the truck's driver after slamming the truck's tailgate. Seconds later, defendant Warden Burl Cain arrived at the surrender site, and then defendant Captain Mark Sharp pulled plaintiff up and off his belly onto a sitting position. Warden Burl Cain then grabbed the plaintiff by the hair with his hand and slammed the plaintiff's head 2 times onto the upper horizontal edge of the closed tailgate. Seconds later, the defendant, Warden Kane, screamed at the plaintiff, "Roy, you're going into a paper gown." Warden Kane then ordered correctional officers Captain Mark Sharp, and upon information and belief, defendant Kevin Groom, an African-American, defendant John Doe number 2, and possibly a defendant John Doe number 3, all positioned in the bed of the truck around the plaintiff, who was belly down again to transport plaintiff to the hospital. John Doe number 1 drove the truck. As the truck drove away, Captain Mark Sharp was sitting up on the wheel well or upper edge of the truck's bed at the plaintiff's right side. Plaintiff was head first and belly down, handcuffed behind his back at all times, except for when Warden Kane slammed the plaintiff's head 2 times onto the truck. John Doe number 2 was positioned to the plaintiff's left. The plaintiff's head was turned to the right or toward defendant Mark Sharp. Upon information and belief, defendant Kevin Groom was positioned at the left rear of the truck's bed and sitting next to the defendant John Doe number 2, who was positioned directly across from defendant Mark Sharp. During the transport of the plaintiff to the penitentiary's hospital, defendant Mark Sharp deliberately, maliciously, sadistically, and expressing gargantuan cowardice assaulted and beat the 52-year-old plaintiff. Man, he is the king of fucking adjectives, right? Defendant Mark Sharp and defendant John Doe number 2 beat the plaintiff with their ass. Is a metal extension baton. You can sling it and it extends out and it's metal. It's got like a ball on the end. Now in Angola, they commonly refer to those as sticks. So Mark Sharp and defendant John Doe number 2, according to this complaint, beat the plaintiff 30 times on the rear of the plaintiff's body, which included his feet, which may have caused the plaintiff's fractured toe, rear leg, buttocks, hands, elbows, and skull. At one point during the beating of the 52-year-old plaintiff, defendant Mark Sharp ordered defendant John Doe number 2, saying, quote, "Try and crack his skull." John Doe number 2 struck the plaintiff 1 time on the back of the plaintiff's head with defendant's metal stick. Defendant Mark Sharp then asked John Doe number 2, saying, quote, "Did you crack his skull?" And John Doe number 2 responded, "I don't think so." Captain Mark Sharp then ordered John Doe, saying, quote, "Hit him again." And the plaintiff was struck a second time on the back of his head. After the second blow to the plaintiff's head, John Doe said, quote, "That boy has got a hard head." Can't make that shit up. Defendants Mark Sharp and John Doe number 2 also kicked and punched the plaintiff several times onto the side of his body from their sitting positions. Upon information and belief, defendant Major Kevin Groom sat by and said nothing or did nothing to stop the beating of the plaintiff during the plaintiff's transport to the hospital. Plaintiff asserts that it was defendant Major Kevin Groom's duty to order the cessation of the assault and battery and or attempted second-degree murder of the 52-year-old plaintiff. Upon arriving at the hospital's sally port, defendant John Doe number 2 advised defendant Mark Sharp that, quote, "We're at the sally port, put your stick up. Someone may see us." The 2 cowardly defendants didn't want other employees or persons to see their acts of cowardness, i.e., beating the plaintiff. Moments before the plaintiff entered the hospital's emergency entrance, John Doe number 2 twisted the plaintiff's fingers on the plaintiff's right hand deliberately, maliciously, and sadistically in an effort to break sane. Medical treatment was administered to the plaintiff at about 2:00 p.m. and the plaintiff was admitted to the hospital's ward at 2:45 p.m. for an overnight stay. On Sunday evening, January 24, 2010, Major Stuart Hawkins from Investigative Services at the Louisiana State Penitentiary arrived at the plaintiff's hospital room and requested the plaintiff to strip naked and the major photograph many areas of the plaintiff's body. On Monday, January 25, 2010, at 10:45 a.m., the plaintiff was transported to Investigative Services and met with Colonel Bobby Acord, who is the department head. Acord had advised the plaintiff he knew the plaintiff had been beaten and asked the plaintiff if he knew who had beaten him. Lieutenant Colonel Gary McDonald presented the plaintiff 4 photographs of correctional officers, and the plaintiff identified one photograph as being one of the assailants. Colonel Gary McDonald asked the plaintiff to sign and date that one photograph, and the plaintiff did so. Upon information and belief, the photograph the plaintiff signed and dated is the photograph of Captain Mark Sharp. Lieutenant Colonel Temple assisted Colonel Gary McDonald in interviewing the plaintiff. Many additional photographs were taken of the plaintiff's battered and bruised body. The plaintiff explained in detail to Colonels Acord, McDonald, and Temple that the plaintiff's attempted simple escape and the beating the plaintiff received from correctional officers. On Tuesday morning, January 26, 2010, plaintiff submitted a request for medical treatment using a form. In plaintiff's request, he stated multiple contusions, puncture wounds, and cuts from an attempted escape on January 24th of 2010. I mean, this dude fucking is lucky he's alive. You shoot on sight when they try to escape, typically. And he's complaining because they, beat his ass because he tried to escape prison for a third time, and he's a convicted murderer. But we'll continue on. Plaintiff questioned why he was not receiving antibiotics and why the plaintiff's elbows, feet, and left toe had not been x-rayed on Sunday, January 24th, 2010. On January 26, 2010, x-rays were taken and revealed the plaintiff's fractured left big toe. The doctors told the plaintiff that surgery to insert a pin in the plaintiff's toe was possible. The plaintiff was prescribed pain-relieving medication. Master Sergeant Glenn Hawkins, a security officer at the hospital, told the plaintiff he hadn't seen an inmate beaten so bad after an attempted simple escape during his 30 years as a correctional officer. Plaintiff asked Master Sergeant Glenn Hawkins, how did he know about the plaintiff's injuries? And Master Sergeant Hawkins said, Roy, my son is Major Stuart Hawkins with Investigative Services, and I know Stuart took photographs of your injuries Sunday evening, and I spoke with Stuart about what had happened to you and the horrific photographic injuries on you. On Tuesday evening, January 26, 2010, plaintiff was confined to the GAR tier at Camp J, commonly referred to as the dungeon. Upon plaintiff walking to the shower area that evening, Sergeant Patrick Strode advised plaintiff that he knew plaintiff had been beaten badly. Plaintiff questioned Sergeant Stroud as to how did he know plaintiff was beaten, and Sergeant Stroud replied, I was out there, Roy, when they put you in that truck, and I saw them beating you when the truck pulled away to the hospital. On Wednesday, January 27th of 2010, Lieutenant Colonel Eli Wilson of Investigative Services visited with the plaintiff, took additional photographs of the plaintiff's face. Plaintiff thought that photographing his face again 3 days after the plaintiff's injury was sustained kind of looked suspicious. Lieutenant Colonel Eli Wilson commented, it looks like your face is healing. On Thursday, January 28, 2010, Defendant Warden Darrell Vanoy interviewed the plaintiff at Camp J. Warden Vanoy notified the plaintiff that he had been in Florida the day of the plaintiff's attempted simple escape and told the plaintiff he had seen the photographs of the plaintiff's injuries. Warden Vanoy told Roy, saying, quote, I wouldn't have wanted my son beaten like you were, Roy. Warden Vanoy also told the plaintiff that if he had been present the day of the plaintiff's escape attempt, no harm would have happened to the plaintiff. Warden Vanoy also told the plaintiff he knew plaintiff was mad about the beating he had received and suggested the plaintiff take it easy for one more week, and then he and the plaintiff would get together in an attempt to settle the matter between themselves so there wouldn't be any need for the plaintiff to contact the FBI or an attorney. Warden Vanoy suggested to the plaintiff, saying, quote, at least let investigative services complete their investigation before the plaintiff contacted any outside agency.
Jim, did you see what happened in Texas today?
Wait, before you tell me that, let me tell you what happened in New York.
It cannot be as crazy as the case I told you about yesterday in Louisiana.
You know what? We should do a podcast about it.
And with that, we did. Crime Wire Weekly covers the crime news headlines that have dominated the week.
We cover trending crimes from all over the country and even sprinkle in a few globally.
Crime Wire Weekly is available now wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Simply by searching Crime Wire Weekly or clicking the link in the description of this podcast. On Friday, January 29th, 2010, the plaintiff submitted an administrative remedy procedure or grievance relative to the deliberate, malicious, sadistic beating of the plaintiff from correctional officers that was received by the penitentiary's legal programs department on February 3rd of 2010. On Monday, February 1st of 2010, plaintiff wrote and mailed letters to attorney Rhonda Covington, FBI, and the U.S. Justice Department in Washington, notifying each agent or agencies of the assault and battery and or attempted to second-degree murder of the plaintiff by correctional officers, and plaintiff requested an investigation of the same from an agent or agency. During the time periods indicated in paragraph 1 through 25 above, and during later dates, the plaintiff disrobed and showed about 18 people as injuries. Some of these individuals are correctional officers, employees, and inmates of Louisiana State Penitentiary. Plaintiff received many different responses from those individuals, i.e. some gasped and some cursed after viewing the malicious and sadistic injuries the plaintiff had received from officers. On Monday, February 1st, 2010, the plaintiff was seen by Dr. Rob Nance at the Camp J Clinic. Dr. Nance examined and or felt the plaintiff's contusions and or hematomas on his upper buttocks and legs. On Tuesday, February 2nd, 2010, Warden Joe, Warden Larry Calvert, and Major Chad Oob visited the plaintiff at Camp J and inquired how plaintiff's injuries were healing. Warden Joe told plaintiff that he had seen the photographs of his injuries and had received the plaintiff's letter expressing the plaintiff's emotional anxiety that defendant Captain Mark Sharp may possibly sneak into Camp J during early morning hours and attempt or cause further injury or silence the plaintiff from revealing what the defendant had done to the plaintiff. Warden Joe assured the plaintiff that defendant Mark Sharp wouldn't be allowed into Camp J and further harm plaintiff. On Wednesday, February 3rd, 2010, Warden Orville, and his last name's hard to pronounce, so I'm going to say L, and Colonel Victorio visited the plaintiff at Camp J and expressed their concern for Warden Butler, who they believe may possibly get into a lot of trouble if the plaintiff were to notify the FBI because defendant Warden Robert Butler had not ordered defendant Mark Sharp to stop stomping or kicking the plaintiff at the surrender site. Warden L notified the plaintiff that Warden Vanoy was going to visit the plaintiff on Monday, February 8th, 2010, and attempt to settle the matter with the plaintiff relative to beating that the plaintiff received. On Wednesday, February 3rd of 2010, at about 7 o'clock p.m., Warden Daryl Vanoy visited the plaintiff at Camp J and told the plaintiff that investigative services was turning their file of the investigation over to the FBI on Thursday, February 4th, 2010. Warden Vanoy gave the plaintiff the name of the special agent as Jason Inslinger or similar last name and opined that the defendant Captain Mark Sharp would be going down the road after the FBI completed their investigation. And Warden Vanoy stated again, quote, "I wouldn't have wanted my son beaten like you were, Roy." On Tuesday, February 9th, 2010, the plaintiff was transported to Investigative Services Department and was interviewed by FBI Special Agent Jason Inslinger, or similar last name, relative to the beating the plaintiff had received. The plaintiff signed a release of his medical records to that agent. Colonel Bobby Acord notified the plaintiff that he had notified the FBI and the West Feliciana Sheriff's Office about the beating that the plaintiff had received. On Monday, March 1st, 2010, Lieutenant C. Howard told the plaintiff he had seen defendant Major Kevin Groom, an African-American, and defendant Captain Mark Sharp at Investigative Services being interviewed by the FBI on Wednesday, February 10th of 2010, and that Lieutenant C. Howard was told that the two defendants were being questioned about the beating the plaintiff had received. On Tuesday, March 9th, 2010, Sergeant Stroud escorted the plaintiff to the shower and told the plaintiff he had told Major Stuart Hawkins of Investigative Services that he knew who was in the back of the truck that had transported the plaintiff to the hospital. Sergeant Stroud told the plaintiff there was an African American in the bed of the truck that day. Sergeant Stroud told the plaintiff that he had told Major Hawkins that he didn't see anything relative to the plaintiff being beaten as the truck pulled away from the surrender site. Plaintiff questioned Sergeant Stroud as to why he didn't tell Major Hawkins that he had saw the officers beating the plaintiff in the truck, especially since Sergeant Stroud had told the plaintiff on Tuesday January 26, 2010, that he had seen officers beating the plaintiff. Sergeant Stroud responded to the plaintiff by saying, quote, "Roy, you know how it goes. I have to live around Mark Sharp," unquote. On Friday, March 19, 2010, plaintiff was seen by Dr. Williamson at the Camp J clinic. Dr. Williamson told the plaintiff he didn't see a reference to the plaintiff's fractured toe in the medical records, but the doctor made a telephone call and heard a recorded dictation about the same. The doctor explained the severity of the fracture to the plaintiff's left big toe. Plaintiff explained to the doctor of a burning-like pain to both upper rear legs and pain and some numbness to the plaintiff's right hand as well as toe pain. On March 20th, 2010, the plaintiff was transported to the penitentiary's hospital for additional x-rays to his left big toe and his right hand. Plaintiff has not been able to view those x-rays to determine the progress relative to his toe healing, although plaintiff has requested medical personnel allow him to do the same. On March 22, 2010, plaintiff submitted a request for medical treatment, requesting to view those x-rays of his refractured toe and obtain a verbal opinion from a doctor. Plaintiff complained again about his right hand pain and some numbness. Plaintiff received no response to his medical request from medical personnel. On Monday, April 5th, 2010, plaintiff submitted a request for medical treatment and complained again of toe and hand pain and headaches that may have been caused from 2 blows to the plaintiff's head from defendant John Doe No. 2. Plaintiff not only complained of toe and hand pain, but also of burning-like sensations to his upper rear legs after walking. The plaintiff attests on April 24, 2010, marked 3 months since he was deliberately, maliciously, and sadistically beaten by correctional officers and still has headaches, toe pain, hand pain, and a burning-like sensation in both rear upper legs. On April 27, 2010, plaintiff was seen by a doctor at the Camp J clinic and was prescribed indomethacin, an anti-inflammatory, to help relieve the plaintiff's pain. On Thursday, May 6 of 2010, plaintiff spoke with Major Stuart Hawkins, and Major Hawkins told the plaintiff those photographs taken of his injuries on January 25, 2010 revealed the severity more than the photos from the day before. On May 10th of 2010, plaintiff was transported to St. Francisville for a court appearance relative to a criminal charge of attempted simple escape. Plaintiff was shocked and had severe emotional stress and anxiety when on that day, plaintiff became aware that one of his transport officers was Sergeant B. Sharp, a young man about 6'4" and about 300 pounds. Sergeant Sharp identified him as a first cousin to Captain Mark Sharp, one of the defendants who maliciously beat him on January 24, 2010. Sergeant Wilson, an African-American, and an elderly officer with the rank of Master Sergeant were also part of the transport team that day. The plaintiff expressed great concern to all the officers above and concern to their supervisors, their lieutenant and captain, about a Sharp family member transporting him on a road trip and carrying a gun. About a month later, before the May 10, 2010 transport of the plaintiff on April 15, 2010, during the early morning hours, expressed emotional distress and anxiety due to Captain James Dowsart and Lieutenant Colonel Randy Ducote about plaintiff's reluctance to being transported to court on April 15th of 2010, especially after being beaten by officers on the transport to the prison hospital. Lieutenant Colonel Ducote advised and assured the plaintiff it would be all right to be transported that morning. On May 12, 2010, plaintiff mailed 2 letters, one to Warden Vinoy and one to mental health or social work clinician David Aikenbrand at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, expressing his emotional distress and anxiety of having been transported by Sergeant Sharp to court on May 10th of 2010. Warden Vinoy didn't respond to the plaintiff's letter. During the week of May 16th, 2010, plaintiff was able to speak with Dave Aikenbrand during the plaintiff's outside rec yard period relative to the plaintiff's emotional distress and anxiety about having to be transported to St. Francisville Court by Sergeant Sharp. On July 4th, 2010, at about 8:55 a.m., on the Shark 1 left tier at Camp J, Sergeant William Holmes asked the plaintiff how things were going with that. Plaintiff responded, "Are you asking me about the beating I received after my attempted simple escape?" And Sergeant Holmes responded, "Yes." The plaintiff asked Sergeant Williams how he knew the plaintiff had been beaten by officers, and Sergeant Williams stated, A few days after your escape attempt, you and I had a short conversation at the prison's hospital, and you told me that I don't ever want to get beat like that. I didn't remember that conversation with Sergeant Williams because during that time, plaintiff was still in a lot of pain due to the beating and blows to the plaintiff's head. On July 6, 2010, inmate Craig Hawkins, DOC number 107714, told the plaintiff at Camp J that he had heard about the plaintiff's attempted simple escape when he had been housed at the B block at the main prison. Hawkins told the plaintiff that when he first arrived at Camp J during June of 2010, he heard inmates talking about how the plaintiff had been beaten by officers after the simple escape attempt. On July 7th of 2010, Sergeant K. Johnson escorted the plaintiff to the Camp J medical clinic for an appointment with Dr. Williamson. During that walk, the plaintiff asked Sergeant Johnson if he had heard prison officials and inmates discussing the plaintiff having been beaten by the correctional officers, and Johnson responded, "Of course, it's common knowledge." During June of 2010, an inmate named Quantrell Kelson asked the plaintiff if he was the inmate who got his ass whipped by correctional officers. Kelson told the plaintiff he had heard about the plaintiff's attempted simple escape and that when Kelson was transferred to Camp J during April of 2010, he had heard a lot of inmates and correctional officers talking about how the plaintiff had been beaten after surrendering. Kelson also told the plaintiff that the escape attempt and the beating of the plaintiff was a big story at Camp J during April of 2010. On July 8th of 2010, inmate Craig Hawkins told the plaintiff that Captain Mark Sharp had beaten inmate Vernon Mitchell at the main prison in 2009. Mitchell's nickname is Filet, and Hawkins advised the plaintiff that Mitchell had filed an ARP or possibly a lawsuit against Captain Sharp. Hawkins told the plaintiff he believed Sharp was transferred to Camp C after beating Mitchell at the main prison. On July 13th of 2010, Andrea Ferguson, who is the commissary personnel at the prison's Camp J, asked the plaintiff if he had called the FBI after the plaintiff was beaten. Plaintiff responded no and told Ferguson that Colonel Acorb with investigative services at Louisiana State Penitentiary had voluntarily telephoned the FBI after viewing the plaintiff's injury. Ferguson then told the plaintiff she had heard officers talking about the FBI had questioned the officers who had beaten the plaintiff and how they had denied beating the plaintiff. Ferguson told the plaintiff that she heard the FBI had showed the photographs of the plaintiff's injuries to those officers. On July 16, 2010, plaintiff began taking the anti-inflammatory Mobic for relief for burning-like sensations to the plaintiff's upper rear legs. Dr. Williamson prescribed the Mobic prescription to him. On July 17, 2010, at 8 a.m. at Camp J Shark Unit, the plaintiff spoke with inmate Rudy Gaspar, who was a tier walker and was housed at Camp D Eagle 2. Plaintiff asked Gaspard if he had heard anything about the plaintiff's attempted simple escape. Gaspard replied yes, and that he had heard an officer speaking about how Burl Kane had beaten or battered the plaintiff also after peacefully surrendering. The plaintiff told Gaspard that that is true relative to what he heard about Warden Kane beating the plaintiff. On July 19, 2010 at 8:15 a.m., plaintiff was outside the rec yard at Camp J Shark Unit and spoke with social worker David Ankenbrand, informed the plaintiff that he had received the plaintiff's letter of July 15, 2010, and the plaintiff's reference in the letter of plaintiff's emotional stress and anxiety relative to several issues, especially the beating the plaintiff received. Ankerbrand told the plaintiff that he would speak with Dr. Reinbold, the prison psychiatrist, and have Dr. Reinbold possibly set an appointment for the plaintiff to discuss several or numerous issues. On July 23, 2010, about 7:30 p.m., Colonel Greg Foster was making his rounds and stopped at the plaintiff's cell at the Shark Unit. Foster asked the plaintiff, "What's the latest news with you and Shark?" Plaintiff advised Foster that plaintiff's appeal was at the Secretary's office of the Louisiana Department of Corrections, and after the Secretary's ruling, the plaintiff was going to let those liars, and then he has in parentheses correctional officers, tell it to the judge and jury. Colonel Foster stated to plaintiff, quote, "Those officers should have been fired, and those pictures showing your injuries is going to be hard for them to overcome." The plaintiff agreed with the colonel's statement, and both agreed that the FBI investigation may very well continue. On July 24th, 2010, the plaintiff spoke with inmate Gary Ashley soon after Ashley was placed in the Shark left tier. Ashley told plaintiff that he had been housed at the Gator unit during the plaintiff's attempted simple escape from the Gator unit. Ashley told the plaintiff that he knew the plaintiff had been beaten by officers and that he had heard a lot of inmates and officers discussing it. On the same day, plaintiff spoke with inmate Quinnell Washington, whom stated, quote, "I heard your simple escape when I was in Camp C Jaguar unit. When I was transferred to Camp J, I heard everybody talking about how you had been beaten badly by officers while handcuffed behind your back and belly down in the back of a truck." On July 29th, 2010, at about 12:30 p.m., plaintiff visited Dr. Reinbold, the prison psychiatrist, as well as Dave Ankenbrand and another gentleman, both mental health and or social worker clinicians at Camp J Clinic. Plaintiff discussed with those clinicians plaintiff's emotional distress and anxiety about not knowing some of the officers who participated in the beating and having been transported to court in St. Francisville by Sergeant B. Sharp. Additional issues relative to the plaintiff being beaten were discussed as well. On August 1st of 2010, plaintiff spoke with Sergeant Stroud about the plaintiff's continual burning sensation to the plaintiff's upper rear legs, an infected left big toe caused by the beating the plaintiff had received. Sergeant Stroud stated to his co-worker, Cadet Fredrickson, quote, "They beat the hell out of Roy." Fredrickson stated to the plaintiff, "I was working at Camp C for Captain Sharp during your escape attempt, and Captain Sharp was part of the chase on you." On August 9th of 2010, about 8:45 a.m., plaintiff spoke with inmate John Kleinpeter outside during rec hour. Kleinpeter told the plaintiff that he had heard Lieutenant M. Miller discussing the plaintiff having been beaten. Kleinpeter also stated the same relative to hearing Sergeant Montgomery, who usually works as a transport officer within the prison's complex. Kleinpeter also stated he had heard a lot of talk among inmates related to the beating while housed at the Camp J Bass dorm. On August 10th of 2010, Warden Jimmy Smith asked the plaintiff how he was doing, and plaintiff responded that he was still healing. Smith said he knew Sharp beat plaintiff. So that is his entire, and I gotta say, very descriptive, well-written statement. So what's he want? Well, his prayer for relief, whereas Roy M. McLaughlin Jr. respectively prays for judgment in his favor and damages in his favor against all defendants in an amount sufficient to compensate him for the injuries, physical and emotional pain and anguish suffered by the plaintiff due to the deliberate, malicious, sadistic, and unjustifiable beating of the plaintiff by defendants, and some defendants' deliberate indifference to the same as follows. 1. Compensation damages in the amount of $350,000 against each defendant jointly. 2. Punitive damages in the amount of $350,000 against each defendant. 3. A jury trial on all issues triable by jury. 4. Plaintiff's cost in the suit. 5. Any additional relief this court deems just, proper, and equitable. And 6. Injunctive relief. This dude's wanting millions for this beating that he suffered after escaping or attempting to escape from bloody Angola. Unbelievable. So what do you think happened? Well, this may shock you. When on January 8th of 2015, and incidentally, this was pulled from the FBI's website, this article, 3 former correctional officers with the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola were sentenced today before U.S. District Judge James Brady for abusing an inmate and engaging in conduct to cover up the criminal conduct. Mark Sharp, 33, received 73 months. Kevin Groom, 47, was sentenced to a year probation and a $500 fine. Matthew Cody Butler, 29, received 2 years probation and a $3,000 fine, according to court documents filed with their guilty pleas. And it goes on to tell about pretty much everything I just read you. But that's right. 3 of those correctional officers were imprisoned and or fined for the abuse of Roy McLaughlin Jr. And if you think that's the end of the story, well, I'm going to give you this little nugget. While I'm researching this and I'm researching these correctional officers, one in particular stood out for a crime that he committed even outside of this. And it relates to a young girl on the B line at Angola, which means that her family worked there. And we'll get into that in the next episode. And we're not done with Roy McLaughlin either. Incidentally, he did receive $8,000 in this lawsuit, but he wasn't done with lawsuits just yet. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, he was suing for millions. Hey, $8,000 to an inmate? That's like $1 million. But we'll get into all that next episode because he's not done with lawsuits yet. And I've got another one from him that you're really not going to believe when I read it. So I'll cover it on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening. Check out the Patreon, patreon.com/Bloody Angola podcast, commercial-free early release episodes and more. If you don't like all the commercials playing on here, check it out. And I want to say, incidentally, I do get complaints from time to time about commercials cutting me off mid-sentence. I need to explain that real quick. iHeartRadio, which are the people that they're my third-party distributor for this podcast, they use AI to insert commercials, and it's not a perfect science. If I pause in the middle of a sentence, that AI reads that as the end of the sentence sometimes, and it'll insert a commercial right there. I hate it. I don't like it any more than you do, but there's just no other option with my particular distributor. So that's why sometimes it'll cut off mid-sentence. Folks, I don't put the commercials in. AI does that, and iHeartRadio does that. Jim Chapman does not do that. So just want to let you know that. You don't need to put a negative comment on, whatever outlet you're listening to right now. I have no control over that. So just wanted to put that out there. And until next time, I'm Jim Chapman for Bloody Angola, a podcast 142 years in the making, the complete story of America's bloodiest prison. Peace.
I walk a straight line, shackled and chained. Oh, gruesome Gertie is calling my name. There is no mercy in this penitentiary. Just ask the Hill String Gang.